The television adaptation of the Books of Blood has been expanded from the stories in Books of Blood with stories that have been developed by me along the style of the original Books of Blood stories. There are, I think, about 30 narratives which I have developed which you could call Books of Blood stories as narrative outlines. We will probably turn at least some of those into episodes for the television series. Clive Barker, January 2019. Unfortunately, the proposed Hulu Books of Blood series that Clive Barker's talking about in that interview, that was based on Barker's own seminal splatterpunk short story collections and featuring new plots devised by the master himself, was never to materialise. Instead, what we eventually got was just a single film, released to Hulu in October of 2020, entitled simply Books of Blood, that advertised itself as featuring a journey into uncharted and forbidden territory through three tales tangled in space and time. And what those amounted to were a new adaptation of Barker's Book of Blood short story, previously filmed for a 2009 film called simply Clive Barker's Book of Blood, the singular article, a version of the original Books of Blood's postscript on Jerusalem Street, and what appeared to be an all-new story, Jenna, that was ostensibly based on new ideas from Clive Barker himself. Jenna is the first of the segments to play out, and it's this story about a young woman that's plagued by this condition called misophonia, which is this kind of Roderick Asher-esque condition whereby certain everyday sounds become magnified to a horrifying degree, meaning that Jenna exists in this constant state of unease, paranoia and fear. Going on the run, Jenna eventually ends up at a rather creepy halfway house that harbours some very dark secrets. We then move on to the second segment, which is the adaptation of Barker's Book of Blood story, which was the wraparound for Volume 1 of his original Books of Blood short story collection, which is about this young man who claims to be able to commune with the dead, and an investigation by a grieving professor into the validity of his claims. We then round things off with a finale that takes Barker's original Books of Blood postscript, the On Jerusalem Street little epilogue, which is concerned with the hunting down of the Book of Blood itself as its starting point, before then folding in the finales of the previous two segments into an overall climax that sort of does its best to tie up all of the unresolved threads from the previous segments. So that is Books of Blood. Now, let's start at the beginning. What we've got here is basically a TV movie. It's a film that's made by a TV studio featuring a creative team comprised largely of people that have worked almost exclusively in television, led by former Star Trek writer Brannon Braga, who is Books of Blood's writer and director. Now, the reason for that is, it becomes clear that from the point when Clive Barker was enthusing over writing new story ideas for the Books of Blood TV series, to when it was then announced later in 2019 that the series had in fact now been cut down to just a single feature-length film, that a lot of the work had clearly already been done on this project in its formative state as something that was intended for TV. It's clear that it was never produced from start to finish as an anthology film, but that instead, at some point, existing scripts or possibly even finished filmed footage for episodes of a TV series was repurposed into this strange, cobbled-together patchwork film. That much becomes abundantly clear when you're actually watching the Books of Blood. So, let's start off with what the Books of Blood does well. First off, I think maybe the best thing about this film is that it's a Clive Barker project. Barker himself was actually involved in the creation of this film, and considering how many Barker-related projects are talked about but never come to fruition, it's always a pleasure to see one that actually finally does make its way to the screen. Because for all that he might seem like a strange choice to helm such a project, whether as a series or as a film, director Brannon Braga is, at the very least, somebody that's a genuine and enthusiastic fan of Clive Barker's works, who is actually legitimately committed to doing justice to Barker's vision, and the two men clearly seem to work well together creatively. It's great that Barker had in fact contributed new ideas to this film, that the Jenna segment features certain interesting little plot points dreamt up by Clive Barker himself that were then worked up into a finished script. Now, just that in itself, that is pretty special. I think it's also impressive that, for an anthology film that uses different narratives, the two main segments that you get in Books of Blood are both good, and there's also some really strong performances. Frida Foshen in Jenna, and I think especially Anna Friel in the Book of Blood story, both give really solid, unshowy turns in the respective pivotal roles. The soundtrack in this is also, I think, really good, coming to us as it does from Joel J. Richard, who's somebody who's done some really phenomenal work on the scores for the John Wick films, as well as a lot of other stuff. It's a very deep, subtle kind of soundtrack that helps to bind the film together and elevate this atmosphere of sort of elegant menace that feels very appropriate for the works of Clive Barker. In fact, overall, the pieces of Books of Blood are all decent in themselves. The biggest issue is in how those pieces are put together. And it's really in the assemblage of all of the various pieces that I think this film really falls apart. For one thing, this is an anthology film that's got basically just two stories in it, no matter how much Brannon Braga insists on telling you that there are actually three. There's two segments, and then there's a wraparound, and the wraparound itself is basically just a little postscript to the actual Book of Blood story. And with just two stories and a vague wraparound, Books of Blood is majorly unbalanced as an anthology. It definitely doesn't offer you the traditional variety of shorts when you've just got these two overlong, unevenly paced stories that, whilst they both are pretty okay in themselves, really don't translate well in the editing from being just the obvious TV episodes that they clearly once were into actual anthology segments. The pacing of an anthology really needs to be much faster. You need to cut to the chase much sooner and strip the story down to just its essential elements, which is why it's really rare to see segments that run from 35 to 45 minutes a piece like these two do. Both stories, but really you notice this especially in Jenna, they both could definitely have done with losing a good solid 10 to 15 minutes of flabby TV movie-ish setup and kind of disease of the week soap opera. And in its place, we really needed, at bare minimum, an entire other story to add just some variety and to keep things fresh and just improve the overall pace of the storytelling and to allow this film to actually work properly as an anthology, as in a collection of stories. Because part of the joy of an anthology film is wondering what the next story is going to be about. It's about knowing you'll have another story coming along soon, trying something different. Books of Blood really does not have that, which is especially disappointing considering just what an incredible range of stories the original source material offered up that you could have chosen from. So, you get the feeling that you're just watching two TV episodes that have been sandwiched together. So what do they do to try and disguise that? Well, they take the two shorts, they chop the ends off each of them and mash them up into the last third non-segment. So what you get is you get the first story that ends very abruptly, leaving you thinking, oh, is that it? Then the second story also ends abruptly, and then everything finally gets resolved in the last 15 minutes in this really muddled, ill-conceived way. It's an absolute mess, to be completely honest. In trying to create some sense of structure, to try and convince us that Books of Blood was always meant to be a film and that all of the stories flow together and work off one another in this deliberate way, Brannon Braga has resorted to basically mutilating each of the stories that would have worked fine in themselves had they been allowed to play out in their entirety as they obviously were originally intended to.
Look how they massacred my boy.
So, unfortunately, Books of Blood ultimately ends up being a frustrating watch. It would have been great to see a series based on Clive Barker's amazing short story collections, because I think they really still do represent some of the ripest of unpicked fruit in the entire canon of classic horror literature. But sadly, that just wasn't to be. So the really frustrating thing is that we almost had it. We got so close. Somebody had actually greenlit the Books of Blood as a series by early 2019. Production was already underway. But by the end of the year, that sympathetic studio guy had gone. Now, if Books of Blood had just been canned, like so many in-development projects often are, it would have been another disappointing near miss. Another Clive Barker project lost in development hell. It's the fact that, rather than just scrapping it, it got cut down. Somehow, that almost feels worse, because it shows a lack of faith in Clive Barker's work as something that an audience would actually want to see. And it's an ignominious fate, ultimately, that we ended up instead with this little cut-down, half-hearted, Frankensteinian sort of hodgepodge, rather than something that actually feels like it's honouring the original Books of Blood themselves. And really, that's the biggest tragedy. Having all of that to work with, having the entirety of the Books of Blood collections to work from, having actual Clive Barker himself along, involved in the production, coming up with new ideas, willing to generate a whole season's worth of new material, and still you pussy out and you pull the plug. The fact that we got anything at all really just feels kind of like, well, we've gone this far down the road, it'll be cheaper to just put out what we've got so far in a cut down form than it would be to just bin it and start over. It feels really cynical and money grabbing the way it's all been put together, and that really works against any residual enthusiasm and love for the material that Brannon Braga could have brought with him. So, sadly, if only they'd left it alone and let it be what it should have been, is the takeaway. And to be honest, that's an epitaph that seems to apply to so many film versions of Clive Barker's works. Nearly every film adaptation of his work that's ever been made has ended up undergoing significant malicious tinkering, from Hellraiser to Nightbreed to Lord of Illusions to Rawhead Rex to The Midnight Meat Train. The list goes on and on. And whilst none of those films, or even the Books of Blood itself, actually suck, in fact they're all entertaining because they all have to varying degrees great Clive Barker stuff in their very DNA, it's hard to look at Books of Blood and not see it as being little more than just rehashed leftovers that have been mashed up into this messy film-shaped lump. And it's also hard to look at it as ultimately being the creation of an interesting Clive Barker adaptation and not the destruction of the series that could have been. Because we could have had a series with up to 30 new Clive Barker stories. Instead, we got a film with one new story and a rehashed version of a Barker short. Not even one of the actual stories, but just the slightest piece from the original collections that we've already seen adapted before. The Books of Blood series that could have been really just looked like it was set to give us so much Barker-y goodness, because Clive Barker himself was actually excited about dreaming up all of these new ideas. And in coming up with new ideas for that series, the 30 narrative outlines that he spoke about in that interview that I referenced right back at the start of this video, Clive Barker was more actively involved in a meaningful, creative way with the Books of Blood than he had been on any adaptation of his work since 1995's Lord of Illusions. Or, to put it another way, the most involved Barker had been with any adaptation of his work since he gave up directing. And why did he give up directing after Lord of Illusions? Because he was sick of getting fucked around with by studios. Now, does that sound familiar?
One of the reasons I don't direct movies as often as I would like to is because I don't have power at that level. And when I write books and I paint my pictures, firstly, nobody interferes with the creation of those things. Nobody is looking over my shoulder asking me why I'm using that blue. Why did you put that verb in that sentence? I don't have producers doing that. And then when it actually comes to the release of the book or the release of the painting, I do have a say in the website and whatever. Now, obviously, the investment involved is much, much smaller, but that seems to me to be an argument for the reverse of what they did, because I swear they had a moneymaker on their hands, and they just left that money on the table.
So, whilst I'm not saying that the level of Clive Barker's involvement in a project can be directly correlated with the quality of the finished product, each of his 3 films that he made as a director have got their own separate troubled histories, for example, there's just so much good shit that Clive Barker's got to offer the world. He's such a powerful source of just pure, raw creativity that you see in all of his novels, that I'd hate for him to finally just get sick of being dicked around and to give up even trying to create new stuff to put on the screen. And really, that is the bigger picture of the Books of Blood. That's what we come away with at the end of all of this. That beyond just being an alright, kind of messy little anthology film, is that it's just another nail in the coffin. We'll always have people adapting his oeuvre to the screen, whether big or small, but Clive Barker himself is not going to be around forever. And every time he signs on to cooperate with a new screen version of one of his works, he must be thinking in the back of his head, firstly, is this actually going to get made? Because really so few of these projects ever seem to make it past just the initial development stage. But more importantly, he must be thinking, how long before I start getting fucked around with again? And sooner or later, he's going to just give up even trying. Because we've already lost Clive Barker the director. I'd hate to lose Clive Barker the writer too. Especially when he's still got such sights. Well, you know.
Enough time for one more story. One more story before 12. Just to keep us warm.
Something I've been wanting to do for a while now, just as a little something extra for those of you who've stuck around until the end, is to throw in a quick little kind of extra post-credits bonus review of just something else that I've been watching. And so today's bonus review is of a 2011 film called Kotoko, directed by, in my opinion, Japan's greatest genre director, Mr. Shinya Tsukamoto, best known as the absolute genius behind the Tetsuo films. But if you're familiar with Shinya Tsukamoto's work, you'll know that not all of his films are just batshit cyberpunk craziness. Kotoko is a much more psychological film that takes place largely in our heroine's head, as we see the world from our very kind of uniquely disturbed perspective. Kotoko, our lead character, played by Japanese singer Koko, who also had heavy involvement with the script and the production design, lives in a constant state of sort of fear and paranoia about keeping her young child safe. She's got a condition whereby when she's out and about, she sees a double of people that she meets, except that the illusionary doppelgangers are almost always extremely violent, meaning that Kotoko is constantly lashing out at phantoms all around her. She struggles constantly to keep her baby safe, and eventually she meets up with the character of Tanaka, a novelist played by the director Shinya Tsukamoto himself, who seems to offer Kotoko a final hope of some kind of salvation and happiness, even though her natural instincts are unerringly self-destructive. Now, Kotoko is a hell of a ride. It's one of the most genuinely unsettling and emotionally distressing portraits of mental illness ever put to screen, and it definitely features, in my opinion, the best and most daringly bold and complex performance from a musical artist in any film. Koko herself in the lead role is anything but just a bit of fancy stunt casting. She's absolutely perfect, as are all of the various tricks that Tsukamoto uses to put us in Kotoko's head, with all these different kind of emotionally devastating fake-outs that happen again and again that really kind of blur the lines between reality and fantasy in just absolutely terrifying ways. The story itself essentially grew out of a desire to explore a mother's fear of losing her child to war, of raising a young child in a world of just constant uncertainty and the threat of violence, and the absolute sense of just anxiety and unease that you get in this film really just reaches out and grabs you by the throat in a way that honestly few other films that I can think of ever have done. I think this is absolutely one of Tsukamoto's very best films, although if you are unfamiliar with his work as a director, I'd say that pretty much everything that he's ever made, that I've seen at least, is worth checking out. Kotoko, for me, loses just a single point, only because it's not the kind of film that you can just pop in over and over again, because of just how genuinely devastating it is following this character's descent into broken down tragedy. Which means that I'm going to rate Kotoko a 9 out of 10. If you love just visceral, psychologically intense character studies that don't shy away from going to the very darkest of dark places, then Kotoko is a top-notch slice of fearless, scary, cinematic brilliance.